The evidence boxes sit in climate-controlled silence, their labels faded but legible: Lloyd, Shannon Rose, 1987, and Cuevas, Renee, 1989. For decades, these containers held more than biological samples and police reports. They held the weight of unanswered questions, the grief of families who never stopped hoping, and the determination of investigators who refused to let time erase the truth. Two young women, two separate tragedies in Orange County, California, two cases that would remain cold for nearly 20 years until science caught up with persistence. Shannon Lloyd, 23, found murdered in her Garden Grove apartment. Renee Cuevas, 27, discovered on a desolate road near El Toro Marine Base. Different cities, different circumstances, but connected by something darker than anyone initially imagined. The killer moved through their lives like a shadow, leaving behind only fragments of DNA and shattered communities. He disappeared into anonymity while families aged with questions and detectives carried files that seemed destined to remain forever open. But evidence, properly preserved, has its own memory. And sometimes, after decades of silence, that memory finally speaks. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The warm California evening of May 21, 1987, settled over Garden Grove like any other. Sprinklers hissed across suburban lawns. Television screens flickered through living room windows. Shannon Rose Lloyd should have been preparing for another day at work, but silence had claimed her modest rented room. Mrs. Garcia, who lived in the adjacent unit, noticed the unusual quiet first. Shannon's radio, which typically played soft music through the thin walls, had been silent for hours. When Shannon failed to appear for her shift the next morning, concern transformed into alarm. Garden Grove, police officers arrived to find the front door unlocked. Inside, the careful organization that defined Shannon's life remained undisturbed. Books aligned on shelves, dishes clean in the sink. Only the bedroom revealed the violence that had shattered this peaceful space. Shannon's body lay motionless, the victim of sexual assault and strangulation. The attack's brutality contrasted sharply with the absence of forced entry, suggesting either deception or familiarity. Detective Martinez, first on scene, immediately secured the perimeter and called for forensic assistance. Crime scene technicians worked methodically through the night. They collected biological evidence with unusual thoroughness: swabs, clothing fibers, fingerprints lifted from door frames and surfaces. The meticulous preservation would prove crucial decades later, though none present could foresee this future significance. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters on the sidewalk, their comfortable assumptions about safety quietly crumbling. Shannon had been careful, responsible, connected to her community. If this could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Garden Grove Police Headquarters buzzed with urgent activity the following morning. Detective Sarah Chen inherited the case, spreading Shannon's life across bulletin boards like scattered puzzle pieces. Phone records, visitor logs, work schedules, each document searched for the thread that might lead to her killer. Interviews revealed a young woman who balanced independence with close community ties. Shannon's creativity and warmth had touched many lives, making the violent nature of her death even more shocking. Co-workers described her thoughtful nature, her careful attention to detail, her plans for the future that would never unfold. The investigation found no immediate suspects. Shannon lived alone, maintained few romantic relationships, and had no known enemies. Her apartment showed no signs of robbery. Jewelry remained untouched, her purse intact with cash and credit cards. The biological evidence collected from the scene underwent preliminary analysis at the county lab. In 1987, DNA profiling remained rudimentary, yielding only basic genetic markers. The partial profile was preserved with unusual thoroughness, an act that would prove crucial decades later, though investigators couldn't know this at the time. Local news covered the homicide with quiet concern. "Garden Grove woman found dead," read the headline, accompanied by Shannon's smiling photograph from a recent family gathering. The story generated fear among single women throughout the community, prompting police to urge extra caution during evening hours. As weeks passed without substantial leads, the intensity of daily investigation gradually diminished. DNA database systems didn't exist in their modern form. The samples yielded no names, no matches, no direction forward. The file remained open, but hope began its slow fade into procedural routine. Fog rolled across the isolated road near El Toro Marine Base in the pre-dawn hours of February 19, 1989. The marine layer obscured streetlights, and created an otherworldly quiet that swallowed sound. It was here, in this desolate stretch between civilization and military installation, that a commuter's headlights revealed something that shouldn't have been there. The driver's 911 call brought Orange County Sheriff's deputies racing through the gray dawn. They found Renee Cuevas, 27 years old, her life stolen by violence that mirrored the Garden Grove case in ways that wouldn't be understood for years. Sheriff's investigators immediately secured a wide perimeter. The location offered multiple escape routes perfect for a predator seeking anonymity. Detective Williams noted the precision and brutality of the attack, the apparent sexual assault, the deliberate disposal of the body. Crime scene technicians arrived as the sun burned through coastal fog. They worked systematically, collecting biological material, documenting shoe impressions in the soft dirt, photographing every angle of the scene. The victim carried no identification, adding initial mystery to the tragedy. Word spread quickly through Irvine's normally quiet communities. A body discovered near the Marine base shattered residents' sense of safety. Parents questioned their daughters' evening plans. Joggers avoided isolated paths. The crime scene's proximity to a military installation created additional unease had violence followed someone home from service. Within hours, Renee's identity was confirmed through fingerprints. Friends and family described an adventurous spirit, someone who embraced life with warmth and laughter. Like Shannon Lloyd 90 miles north, Renee had no apparent connection to her killer, an ordinary person caught in extraordinary darkness. The case was assigned to Orange County Sheriff's Department Homicide Unit, where it would remain active but increasingly cold for the next decade. Spring 1989 brought parallel investigations that moved along separate tracks. Garden Grove Police Department and Orange County Sheriff's Department worked their respective cases with dedication but little coordination. Communication between agencies remained limited, creating investigative silos that prevented pattern recognition. Detective Chen continued pursuing leads in Shannon's case, re-interviewing witnesses, and following up on tips that led nowhere. The biological evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. Bulletins were filed and archived, distributed to neighboring departments as routine procedure demanded. Meanwhile, Detective Williams and his team reconstructed Renee's final days. They traced her movements, interviewed acquaintances, searched for connections that might explain her presence on that isolated road. The investigation found no boyfriend, no stalker, no obvious threat in her recent past. Both departments noted similarities in their cases: the precision of the attacks, the sexual violence, the apparent randomness of victim selection. However, without DNA analysis to confirm connections, these observations remained speculative. Detectives discussed possibilities during informal conversations, but lacked proof to justify joint investigation. Media coverage focused on rising county crime rates rather than potential links between cases. Shannon's murder had faded from front pages. Renee's death generated brief headlines before disappearing beneath other news. Both cases began their slow drift into the cold case files that filled departmental storage rooms. Budget constraints and heavy caseloads meant limited resources for investigations that showed little progress. DNA testing remained expensive and time-consuming. The samples from both scenes were properly stored, their potential waiting for future breakthroughs in forensic science. As 1989 became 1990, both cases grew cold despite the persistent efforts of investigators who sensed connections they couldn't yet prove. The late 1990s found evidence storage rooms throughout Orange County housing thousands of unsolved cases. Cardboard boxes lined metal shelving, each containing the remnants of interrupted lives and frustrated investigations. Among them, the files for Renee Cuevas and Shannon Lloyd survived intact, their biological evidence properly maintained, despite the passage of time. Cold case units emerged as departments recognized the value of revisiting old investigations with fresh eyes and improved technology. Detective Rodriguez, newly assigned to Garden Grove's Cold Case Division, pulled Shannon's file from storage and spread its contents across his desk. The photographs, witness statements, and evidence logs told a story frozen in time. Similarly, Orange County Sheriff's Detective Morrison inherited Renee's case along with dozens of others from the 1980s and early 1990s. She noted the meticulous evidence collection, the preserved biological samples, the detailed scene documentation that might yield new information under modern analysis. DNA technology was advancing rapidly, offering hope for cases that had seemed permanently stalled. Both detectives flagged their respective files for future testing, recognizing that the careful evidence preservation by their predecessors had created opportunities that didn't exist in 1987 and 1989. Families grew older while maintaining quiet contact with investigators. Anniversary calls brought brief updates but little progress. Shannon's parents aged with questions. Renee's siblings kept her memory alive while hoping for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely. The calendar turned toward the new millennium, with both cases remaining open but dormant. Evidence boxes waited in climate-controlled storage, their contents holding secrets that time and technology would eventually reveal. The Orange County Crime Lab in 2003 hummed with advanced equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators 16 years earlier. Forensic analyst Dr. Patricia Kim worked methodically through a stack of cold case samples, comparing DNA profiles that had been extracted using improved techniques. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon. DNA from the Cuevas crime scene matched genetic markers found at Shannon Lloyd's apartment. After years of separate investigations, the cases were officially linked by science. One unidentified offender had killed both women. Dr. Kim immediately contacted both agencies. The conference call that followed marked a watershed moment. Two cases became one, doubling the evidence while confirming investigators' long-held suspicions about connected crimes. Detective Morrison and Detective Rodriguez met to combine their files. Witness statements were cross-referenced. Geographic analysis revealed the killer's familiarity with Orange County. Timeline construction suggested someone who moved freely between communities without detection. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database, but returned no matches. The killer remained anonymous despite his genetic signature being preserved in evidence storage. Media coverage noted the potential serial killer connection, but generated little fanfare among a public grown weary of unsolved cases. Families received notification that their loved ones' cases were now linked. The news brought mixed emotions. Confirmation that their daughters had encountered the same predator, but no name to attach to the violence that had shattered their lives. The investigation gained new energy from the linkage, but the killer's identity remained hidden. Detectives settled in for a longer wait, knowing that their evidence was solid but incomplete. The 2000s and 2010s saw generations of investigators carrying forward the linked cases of Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. Detective Morrison retired, passing the file to Detective Santos. Detective Rodriguez moved to Robbery Division, handing Shannon's case to Detective Park. The institutional memory persisted, even as personnel changed. Each new investigator brought fresh perspective to evidence that had been examined countless times. Witness interviews were repeated with older, sometimes more willing participants. The DNA profile was retested on increasingly sophisticated equipment, though it continued yielding the same frustrating result: a clear genetic signature with no name attached. Geographic analysis suggested possible connections to Nevada, particularly Las Vegas, based on travel patterns and timing. Investigators noted that both crime scenes offered easy access to interstate highways, suggesting someone who moved frequently between states. These insights were documented but led nowhere without additional evidence. Families spoke, occasionally to the press during anniversary coverage. Renee's sister appeared on local television, asking anyone with information to contact authorities. Shannon's parents released a statement expressing continued faith in law enforcement's efforts. Hope flickered but endured through decades of disappointment. Time eroded some memories while sharpening others. Key witnesses passed away, taking their recollections with them. Crime scenes were redeveloped or demolished. The physical world changed while evidence boxes preserved fragments of the past. By the late 2010s, investigators began exploring emerging genealogy tools that promised new approaches to identifying unknown DNA profiles. The cases that had defined careers were about to enter their final phase. Investigative genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary tool in the late 2010s, offering hope for cases that had exhausted traditional forensic approaches. Orange County District Attorney's Office authorized IgG analysis for the linked Lloyd Cuevas cases, recognizing the potential for breakthrough after decades of frustration. The process began with uploading the crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases used by millions of Americans searching for family connections. Unlike CODIS, which required exact matches from convicted offenders, IgG could identify distant relatives who shared small portions of genetic material with unknown suspects. Initial results appeared within weeks: third and fourth cousins, whose family trees could be traced through public records and genealogical research. Professional analysts began the painstaking process of building family trees from fragments of shared DNA and documentary evidence. The Golden State Killer case had demonstrated IgG's potential for solving high-profile cold cases, generating optimism throughout law enforcement. Public interest in genetic genealogy soared as families learned they might finally receive answers that traditional investigation couldn't provide. However, IgG required careful legal and genealogical work that moved slowly compared to television portrayals. Each family tree took weeks to construct. Dead ends were common. The process demanded patience from investigators and families who had already waited decades for resolution. As analysts worked through the genetic maze, all lines of investigation began converging on a name that had never appeared in either case file: Reuben J. Smith, a Las Vegas resident whose connection to the crimes would soon become clear. The genealogist's office in Orange County resembled a detective's evidence room, with family trees covering every wall and genetic charts spread across multiple tables. Analyst Jennifer Walsh worked methodically through generations of birth certificates, marriage records, and obituaries, following DNA connections backward through time. The breakthrough required connecting dozens of distant relatives whose shared genetic material pointed toward common ancestors in the early 1900s. From these branches, Walsh constructed forward-flowing family trees that identified potential descendants who could have contributed DNA to the crime scenes. Census records, Social Security databases, and public documents gradually narrowed the search. Multiple family lines converged on Reuben J. Smith, born in 1965, whose age and geographic connections made him a viable suspect. Initial background research revealed a Las Vegas address and a criminal history that included violence. The law enforcement community buzzed with cautious optimism as the genealogical analysis pointed toward Smith. However, preliminary research revealed a complicating factor. Smith appeared to be deceased, eliminating the possibility of traditional arrest and trial. Detective Santos contacted Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department to verify Smith's status and gather additional information. The call confirmed that Reuben J. Smith had died by suicide in 1999, 6 years after Renee Cuevas's murder and 12 years after Shannon Lloyd's death. Despite this development, investigators pressed forward with plans to confirm Smith's identity through direct DNA comparison. If genealogy had identified the correct suspect, traditional forensic analysis would provide definitive proof of his connection to both crimes. Las Vegas stretched beneath blazing Nevada sun as Orange County detectives arrived to reconstruct Reuben J. Smith's life. Detective Santos and Detective Park worked with local authorities to gather documents, interview contacts, and build a comprehensive picture of the man IgG had identified as their suspect. Smith's history revealed a pattern of violence and instability. Arrest records showed a 1998 charge for violent sexual assault, demonstrating behavior consistent with the crimes against Shannon and Renee. Employment files indicated frequent job changes and residence moves, suggesting someone who avoided long-term commitments or community connections. Vehicle registration showed Smith owned cars that could have made the California trips during the relevant time periods. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, unremarkable, someone who kept to himself and generated little attention. The picture that emerged was of a predator who operated beneath community awareness. The investigation confirmed Smith's 1999 suicide, which had occurred without any connection to the California cases. He had never been questioned about Shannon's or Renee's murders. His death meant that even definitive DNA evidence would bring no courtroom justice, no trial testimony, no opportunity for families to confront their loved one's killer. However, Nevada authorities had preserved biological samples from Smith's 1998 arrest, providing the DNA source needed for comparison. The samples were carefully transported to Orange County's crime lab for analysis that would either confirm or eliminate Smith as the suspect. Press archives confirmed Smith's violent history, while revealing no prior connection to Orange County. He remained a stranger to the communities he had terrorized, someone who had slipped past investigative assumptions about familiar perpetrators. Orange County Crime Lab received Smith's DNA samples with the gravity of a case that had consumed decades of investigative effort. Dr. Kim supervised the analysis personally, understanding that these tests would either solve two of the county's most persistent cold cases or eliminate their primary suspect. The comparison process required careful verification and multiple confirmations. Smith's genetic profile was tested against both the Cuevas and Lloyd crime scene evidence using the most advanced techniques available. Quality control measures ensured accuracy that would withstand legal scrutiny. Results arrived after 3 days of analysis. Smith's DNA matched both crime scenes with statistical certainty that exceeded courtroom standards. Probability calculations showed odds of random coincidence in the billions to 1 range. The man identified through genealogy was definitively connected to both murders. Dr. Kim contacted Detective Santos with the confirmation that ended 36 years of uncertainty. A single man, Reuben J. Smith, had killed both Shannon Rose, Lloyd, and Renee Cuevas. The biological evidence that had waited decades in storage had finally revealed its secret. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their response to the breakthrough. Press conferences were scheduled. Family notifications were planned. Legal experts reviewed procedures for announcing resolution of cases involving deceased suspects. The revelation reframed everything investigators thought they knew. Smith had never appeared in either case file, never been questioned, never generated suspicion. He was a stranger who had entered both women's lives with devastating consequences before disappearing into anonymity. The community that had waited so long for answers was about to learn the truth. The Orange County District Attorney's Office convened senior staff to coordinate the public announcement that would end decades of mystery. Reuben J. Smith's identity had been confirmed internally across all agencies. Prosecutors, detectives, crime lab personnel, and family liaison officers were briefed on the breakthrough. Legal experts reviewed precedents for announcing case resolution involving deceased suspects. Without the possibility of prosecution, the announcement required careful framing that balanced transparency with sensitivity to families who would receive answers, but no courtroom justice. Evidence charts were prepared for public display, showing the genealogical path from crime scene DNA to Smith's identification. IgG methodology was explained in accessible terms for media and community consumption. Timeline displays illustrated the connection between two crimes that had remained separate for 16 years. Coordination between Garden Grove Police and Orange County Sheriff's Department ensured unified messaging. Both agencies would share credit for the persistence that kept evidence viable through technological advancement. The cooperation contrasted with early siloed investigations. Media speculation increased as word spread of an impending announcement regarding the linked cases. Leaks suggested a dead suspect development, generating anticipation within communities that had followed the investigation for decades. Family representatives met with victim advocates to prepare for intense media attention following the announcement. The revelation would bring relief mixed with frustration, answers at last, but no opportunity to see justice served in a courtroom. The stage was set for public revelation of a truth that had remained hidden for 36 years. Cameras filled the Orange County District Attorney's conference room as officials prepared to name Shannon Lloyd and Renee Cuevas' killer. District Attorney Patricia Williams approached the podium with charts displaying DNA evidence, genealogical connections, and timeline analysis that had solved two of the county's most persistent cold cases. Today, we can finally provide answers to families who have waited decades for justice, Williams began. Through advanced DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy, we have identified Reuben J. Smith as the perpetrator of both murders. The announcement detailed Smith's Las Vegas residence, his 1998 arrest for sexual assault, and his 1999 suicide that had prevented traditional prosecution. IgG methodology was explained, showing how distant DNA relatives had led investigators to a suspect who had never appeared in either case file. Media erupted with questions about Smith's connection to Orange County, his selection of victims, and the possibility of additional crimes. Officials acknowledged that Smith's travel patterns and violent history suggested potential for other offenses, though no additional cases had been definitively linked. Headlines exploded across California within hours. Cold case killer identified. After 36 years, led evening newscasts. Social media amplified the story, as true crime enthusiasts shared details of the breakthrough. Relief mixed with anger, as communities processed the revelation. The public learned that two murders had been linked for 20 years, a detail that surprised many who had followed the cases separately. Smith's status as a complete stranger challenged assumptions about familiar perpetrators, while highlighting the randomness that had terrified communities. Outside the courthouse, family members prepared to address media and community supporters who had followed their decades-long wait for answers. Renee's sister, Maria, approached the microphone cluster with statements that had been carefully prepared but carried deep emotion. Learning Reuben Smith's name doesn't bring Renee back, Maria said, her voice steady despite obvious pain. But knowing who took her from us helps us understand what happened. We're grateful to everyone who never gave up. Shannon's parents, now in their 70s, spoke of persistent advocacy with detectives who had carried their daughter's case across decades. Personal photographs and preserved case files were shared with media, humanizing victims who had become statistics in cold case databases. Shannon was careful, thoughtful, planning for a future that was stolen from her, her father said. Knowing that a stranger took that future helps us process what we've carried all these years. Family members revealed their quiet work, with investigators' anniversary calls evidence reviews, genetic sample donations that had supported the eventual breakthrough. Their cooperation had provided emotional ballast to cases that might otherwise have been forgotten. The emotional void left by Smith's suicide was acknowledged but not dwelt upon. Families expressed preference for truth over courtroom proceedings that might have re-traumatized them while providing uncertain outcomes. Social media rallied behind families with messages of support and admiration for their persistence. The announcement had transformed private grief into public recognition of survival and advocacy. Orange County Cold Case Unit investigators used Smith's confirmed identity to examine other unsolved cases from the same time period. Detective Santos spread files across conference tables, searching for patterns that might connect Smith to additional crimes beyond Shannon and Renee's murders. Unmatched case files were reviewed for geographic proximity, victim demographics, and assault methodologies that might indicate Smith's involvement. His Las Vegas residence and apparent travel to California suggested a predator comfortable operating across state lines. Several unsolved sexual assaults from the late 1980s and early 1990s showed similarities to Smith's established pattern, though DNA evidence was either unavailable or degraded beyond useful analysis. Investigators documented possible connections, but could not establish definitive links. Smith's timeline was reconstructed using employment records, residence changes, and vehicle registrations. The analysis revealed frequent movement that could have facilitated additional crimes, though gaps in documentation prevented comprehensive mapping of his activities. Public speculation about other victims spread through media coverage, generating tips and inquiries from families of unsolved cases throughout California and Nevada. Each lead required careful evaluation to distinguish between legitimate possibilities and wishful thinking from desperate families. The investigation team maintained focus on confirmed evidence, while acknowledging that Smith's death had eliminated the possibility of extracting information about additional crimes through interrogation or plea negotiations. Internal review continued quietly, balancing thoroughness with recognition that some questions might remain forever unanswered. Orange County Sheriff's Office hosted a retrospective gathering for investigators who had worked the Cuevas and Lloyd cases across 3 decades. Current and retired detectives, crime lab personnel, and prosecutors reflected on evidence, stewardship, and persistence that had enabled the eventual breakthrough. Detective Morrison, who had linked the cases in 2003, emphasized the importance of proper evidence storage from the original crime scenes. Without the meticulous collection by officers in 1987 and 1989, none of this would have been possible, she noted. Evidence logs were reviewed to understand the chain of custody that had preserved biological samples through multiple moves, technology upgrades, and personnel changes. The documentation revealed institutional commitment to cases that might easily have been forgotten or discarded. Original crime scene technicians attended the gathering, their careful work finally vindicated by scientific advancement they couldn't have imagined. Their thoroughness had created the foundation for IgG success 30 years after collecting DNA samples. Lab preservation records showed how evidence storage protocols had evolved while maintaining sample integrity. Temperature controls, contamination, prevention, and documentation standards had protected genetic material through decades of technological change. Media coverage praised detectives' decades-long efforts while raising questions about resource allocation for cold cases. Editorial discussions emerged about which cases could receive expensive IgG analysis and how departments should prioritize limited forensic budgets. The case became a model for evidence preservation and interdisciplinary cooperation that would influence cold case procedures throughout California and beyond. California hosted a forensic conference featuring the Lloyd Cuevas case as a model for successful IgG implementation. Orange County officials presented their methodology to law enforcement agencies, considering genetic genealogy for their own cold cases. Dr. Kim explained the technical aspects of DNA extraction, database comparison, and genealogical analysis that had identified Smith. Charts displayed the family tree construction process, showing how distant relatives had led to suspect identification through documented ancestry research. The presentation emphasized IgG's ability to identify perpetrators who had no personal connection to victims or investigators. Unlike traditional investigation that relied on witness memory or physical evidence linking known suspects, IgG could reach across decades to find strangers who had avoided detection. Conference attendees learned about legal considerations, privacy concerns, and resource requirements for implementing IgG programs. The process demanded specialized expertise, significant financial investment, and careful coordination between law enforcement and genealogical analysts. Privacy advocates raised concerns about genetic database usage for law enforcement purposes, questioning consent procedures and data protection protocols. The debate reflected broader societal questions about balancing individual privacy with public safety interests. Public fascination with IgG grew as conference coverage explained the science behind high-profile case resolutions. Media attention generated interest in genetic genealogy among families seeking to solve their own cold cases. The Lloyd Cuevas breakthrough contributed to expanding acceptance of IgG as a legitimate investigative tool worthy of public support and institutional investment. News studios and newspaper offices throughout California began producing comprehensive retrospectives that reconstructed the 36-year timeline for public consumption. Investigative journalists interviewed original detectives, reviewed archival footage, and compiled detailed accounts of how 2 cold cases had finally been solved. Television documentaries featured dramatic recreations of crime scenes, interviews with surviving investigators, and explanations of IgG methodology that had identified Smith. The productions balanced true crime entertainment with educational content about forensic advancement. Archival footage showed press conferences from the original investigations, revealing how limited technology had frustrated early efforts to solve the cases. Interviews with retired detectives illustrated the personal investment that had sustained investigation across decades of disappointment. Geographic analysis was presented to help viewers understand how El Toro's isolation had aided Smith's escape and concealment. Maps displayed travel routes between Las Vegas and Orange County, showing how interstate access had facilitated his predatory activities. Media coverage generated renewed trust in cold case units, while highlighting the importance of evidence preservation and technological advancement. Public perception of law enforcement's persistence improved as audiences learned about decades-long commitment to unsolved cases. Some coverage criticized delays in adopting IgG technology, questioning why cases had remained unsolved for years after genealogical tools became available. Agency responses emphasized budget constraints and legal cautions that had slowed implementation. The retrospectives helped communities process complex emotions surrounding resolution without traditional justice outcomes. Garden Grove organized a memorial service to honor Shannon Rose Lloyd's life and acknowledge the community healing that followed case resolution. The gathering focused on remembering Shannon's vibrant personality rather than the violence that had ended her life. Friends shared memories of Shannon's creativity, her warmth toward others, and her careful attention to detail that had characterized both her personal and professional relationships. Personal letters and photographs created a portrait of someone whose potential had been stolen by random violence. Community members reflected on how Shannon's murder had affected neighborhood dynamics, changing evening routines and social interactions for years afterward. The fear that had gripped Garden Grove was acknowledged alongside gratitude for eventual resolution. Former co-workers described Shannon's plans for the future career aspirations, travel dreams, relationship hopes that had been destroyed by Smith's attack. The memorial emphasized what had been lost rather than dwelling on the circumstances of her death. Garden Grove Police Department representatives spoke about the case's impact on investigative procedures and evidence preservation protocols. Shannon's case had influenced training programs and policy development that would benefit future investigations. The contrast between Shannon's careful nature and the sudden violence that had ended her life was acknowledged without sensationalism. Her thoughtfulness and community connections made the randomness of her murder more difficult to process emotionally. The service concluded with commitment to remember Shannon as she had lived rather than how she had died. Irvine community members gathered near the former El Toro Marine Base to honor Renee Cuevas' memory and acknowledge how case resolution had affected their understanding of the crime that had shattered their sense of security. The location allowed reflection on geography's role in the case. Renee's adventurous spirit and warm laugh were remembered through stories shared by friends and family members. News clippings and preserved items illustrated her engagement with life and community connections that had made her murder particularly shocking. Former Marine personnel who had been stationed at El Toro during 1989 recalled hearing nothing unusual on the night of Renee's murder, underscoring the isolation that had aided Smith's escape. The base's closure and redevelopment had changed the landscape while preserving memories of tragedy. Community vigilance around cold cases increased following case resolution, with residents expressing renewed confidence in law enforcement's ability to solve seemingly impossible investigations. The breakthrough demonstrated that time didn't necessarily favor perpetrators who avoided immediate detection. The absence of trial testimony left some community members feeling unsatisfied with the resolution's finality. Smith's suicide had eliminated opportunities for courtroom confrontation and detailed confession that might have provided additional closure. Memorial discussions emphasized Renee's qualities and relationships, rather than focusing on Smith's identity or motivations. The gathering celebrated her life while acknowledging the community's collective healing process. Renewed commitment to supporting other families awaiting cold case resolution emerged from the memorial service. Orange County Sheriff's Office conducted formal closure ceremonies for both cases, with detectives officially marking the Lloyd and Cuevas investigations as solved after decades of active pursuit. Evidence boxes were transferred to permanent archives with honor appropriate to their significance. Final reports documented the complete investigative timeline from initial crime scene response through IGG identification and confirmation. Interagency acknowledgments recognized cooperation between Garden Grove Police, Orange County Sheriff's Department, and federal laboratories that had contributed to eventual success. Detective Santos and Detective Park participated in emotional handoff procedures, transferring cases that had defined portions of their careers to historical archives. The moment represented both professional achievement and personal closure for investigators who had carried these files for years. Case documentation became training material for new detectives, learning cold case procedures and evidence preservation protocols. The Lloyd Cuevas investigation would influence investigative methods and technological applications for future cases. Public ceremonies marked the transition from active investigation to historical record. Community members attended to acknowledge the persistence that had sustained hope through decades of uncertainty. Officials emphasized that case closure represented answers rather than traditional justice. Given Smith's suicide, the distinction was important for managing public expectations about what resolution could realistically provide. Media coverage highlighted institutional memory and evidence stewardship as critical factors in eventual success, encouraging other agencies to maintain similar standards for their unsolved cases. Orange County District Attorney's Office hosted a public forum examining lessons learned from the Lloyd Cuevas investigation. Officials outlined key insights about evidence stewardship, interagency collaboration, and the intersection of technology with persistent detective work. Case charts illustrated breakthrough moments that had advanced the investigation: initial DNA linkage in 2003, IGG implementation in 2018, and final confirmation through traditional analysis. Each advancement had built upon previous work, while requiring new expertise and resources. The presentation emphasized that without careful evidence collection and preservation from the 1980s crime scenes, IGG analysis would have been impossible regardless of technological advancement. Original officers' thoroughness had created opportunities that weren't realized for 3 decades. Community representatives expressed renewed trust in law enforcement's commitment to unsolved cases. The breakthrough demonstrated institutional memory and resource dedication that surprised some residents who had assumed old cases were forgotten. Advocacy groups pushed for increased funding for cold case units and IGG programs, arguing that the Lloyd Cuevas success proved the value of sustained investment in unsolved investigations. Budget discussions revealed the high cost of comprehensive genetic genealogy analysis. Legal experts addressed privacy concerns and consent issues surrounding IGG usage, acknowledging ongoing debates about balancing individual rights with public safety interests. The discussion reflected broader societal questions about genetic information usage. The forum concluded with commitment to applying lessons learned to other cold cases, awaiting resolution throughout Orange County. Evening quiet settled over Renee's family home as relatives gathered for private reflection on what case resolution meant for their long journey through grief. The public announcements and media attention had ended, leaving space for personal processing of truth finally revealed. DNA reports and press articles were carefully stored alongside family photographs and memorial items that had sustained hope through decades of uncertainty. The documentation represented both scientific achievement and emotional milestone in their healing process. Family conversations acknowledged that learning Smith's identity had changed their mourning without eliminating their loss. Truth provided context for violence that had previously seemed inexplicable, though it couldn't restore what had been taken. The absence of courtroom proceedings was discussed with mixed emotions. Some family members expressed relief at avoiding trial trauma, while others wished for opportunity to hear detailed confession or explanation of Smith's motivations. Social media tributes continued flowing from supporters who had followed the case for years. Messages of sympathy and admiration created virtual community around shared experience of waiting and hoping for resolution. Private discussions focused on moving forward with knowledge rather than remaining frozen by unanswered questions. Smith's identification had provided the missing piece that allowed emotional processing to advance beyond perpetual uncertainty. The family acknowledged their gratitude for investigators who had never abandoned hope, forensic analysts who had preserved evidence across decades, and community members who had maintained interest in cases that might otherwise have been forgotten. Years later, Orange County Cold Case Unit welcomed new detectives to training sessions that featured the Lloyd Cuevas investigation as a foundational example of persistence, evidence preservation, and technological adaptation. Fresh investigators studied archived genealogical files and lab reports that had solved two of the county's most challenging cases. Detective Williams, now senior supervisor, explained how the investigation had evolved across decades while maintaining focus on evidence-based conclusions. Officers learned about proper sample collection, storage protocols, and documentation standards that could support future IgG analysis. The case files were presented as inspiration, rather than burden proof, that unsolved cases could yield answers, even after decades of apparent stagnation. Young detectives absorbed lessons about institutional memory and the importance of maintaining hope when traditional methods reached dead ends. Technology demonstrations showed how IgG methodology worked, from database searches through family tree construction to suspect identification. The education helped new investigators understand resources available for their own cold cases. Community faith in justice endured, strengthened by the Lloyd Cuevas breakthrough that had demonstrated law enforcement's commitment to cases that seemed permanently stalled. Public support for cold case units increased following the resolution. The archive room housing evidence boxes told its own story about the balance between time and truth. Each container represented families waiting for answers and investigators refusing to accept defeat. The camera lingered on boxes marked "Solved Testaments to Persistence" that had outlasted the predator who thought time would protect his secrets. In the end, memory preserved in evidence had proven stronger than the silence that violence had tried to impose.